Hi, my name is Leslie Terebessy, and this is the first installment of a series of videos on the question of how Islam became political. Just very briefly, I would like to mention the 6 stages, and then we will begin and delve into the first stage, which is the repression of reason. So now the first stage in this process was the subordination of reason to tradition. The second stage that we will investigate will be the elevation of tradition to an equal of revelation. The third video will explore the elevation of tradition to a judge of revelation, in other words, to a level of even higher than revelation, while the fourth video will explore the alleged abrogation of revelation by tradition. So, what we are witnessing here is a gradual elevation of tradition at the expense of both reason and revelation. In the fifth stage, we will be looking at the replacement of rulings derived from revelation by rulings derived from tradition. In other words, we will be exploring how revelation itself began to be replaced by traditions in selected places. Finally, the last video will be looking at the emergence of political Islam in the form of the doctrine of the so-called conflict or clash between the Darul Islam, the abode of peace on the one hand, and the Darul Harb or the abode of war on the other. So, having taken a look ahead, so to speak, let us begin now at the beginning and ask ourselves, how did this process of the transformation of the teaching of revelation, how did this process of the transformation of the religion of peace into political Islam actually take place? Well, it all started with what we have referred to as the repression of reason. And what led to the repression of reason in the history of Islam? It began with the so-called struggle between the rationalists, between two groups of Muslims. One group were the rationalists, or the Ahlil al-Rai, as they are sometimes called, while the other group were the followers of tradition, or the Ahlil Hadith, as they are also sometimes referred to. Now, these two groups had a sort of conflict or disagreement about what was the best way to understand, interpret revelation. The rationalists argued that reason was the best means of understanding the Quran, while the traditionists begged to disagree, and they maintained that in fact tradition was better suited to explain revelation than reason. The traditionists went even so far as to assert that the use of reason to understand revelation or the Quran was a form of disbelief or kufr. To back up their case, they have produced a tradition in which the Prophet allegedly stated that anyone who uses his reason to understand or interpret the Quran is actually committing a form of kufr or disbelief. So, in this way, the traditionists actually disarmed the rationalists and prevented them, or tried to prevent them, from using the best tool that the rationalists had to understand revelation and even to argue their case, which was simply the recourse to reason or reasoning. However, the traditionists did not only resort to tradition in order to make their case in favor of using tradition rather than reason to explain revelation. They happened to have also the support of the political authorities of the day, in particular the support of Musa al-Hadi. And then something happened in 786, which was actually a political expression of the repression of reason in Muslim history. I am referring to the so-called slaughter of 5,000 philosophers or free thinkers, as they were sometimes called. The Arabic term used is zindiq or zandaka, and this slaughter took place, as I mentioned, at the height of the support being generated in favor of tradition, and it represented a kind of backlash against the rationalists, this time on the political plane. And this event was in fact reported by al-Suyuti, who was a well-known Muslim commentator, and was referred to by Jamaluddin al-Afghani in his debate with Renan, the French Orientalist. The reference to this unfortunate event may be found in a book called Modernist Islam, which was edited by Charles Kurzman and published by Oxford University Press. The reference can be found in the article on Jamaluddin al-Afghani. So, as we have seen, the repression of reason or reasoning took place in early Muslim history on two levels. One was the conceptual or analytical level in theology, so to speak, while the other manifestation of the repression of reason took place on the political plane in the form of the mass slaughter of the so-called freethinkers or philosophers that I have already referred to, and that was reported by first by Suyuti in his writing approximately 500 years ago. So now these were two manifestations of the backlash against reason. But the backlash against reason or the repression of reason did not stop there. It continued and it found two further manifestations. The first of these additional manifestations of the repression of reason took the form of the so-called closure of the gates to ijtihad, or the shutting of the gates to independent reasoning, which took place approximately in the year 1000. In this period, it was decided by the ulama that the work of explaining the Sharia was pretty much complete, and there was nothing really further to add, and all that all that the subsequent ulama had to do was to follow the work of their predecessors. So now in this process, what happened is that not only the Quran but even the Sunnah were marginalized, pushed in, as it were, into a remote place, and they were replaced essentially by the work of the ulama, which at this point became the highest authority, or even we can say the primary source of reference. The Muslim ulama that came afterwards, after the declaration of the so-called closure of the gates to reasoning, were actively discouraged, in some cases even prohibited, from referring directly to the Quran and the Sunnah, and instead were expected to refer and defer to the work of their predecessors, the former ulama. So this event ushered in what we call the period of taqlid, or unquestioning following of tradition, and it also signaled the decline of the independent reasoning among the Muslim ulama known as ijtihad. The process was further reinforced. I mean, the process of the repression of reasoning was further reinforced by one additional event, and that was the publication of Imam al-Ghazali's book or criticism of the philosophers, known as the Tahafut al-Falasifa, or the incoherence of the philosophers. This delivered, as it were, an additional blow to the reason, or the use of rationality in matters of religion. And Al Ghazali's work actually emphasized more of a mystical approach, a Sufi approach to the knowledge of Islam, which did not see or does not recognize any significant role for the use of reason in comprehending and even applying the knowledge of revelation. So these, in a nutshell, were the main forces or events that led to the repression of reasoning in Muslim history and in Muslim tradition. Now, a number of Muslim or contemporary Muslims have attempted to revive the tradition of rationalism in Islam, and among them was, for example, Muhammad Abdu and a few others. Even Umar Chapra has a book, a contemporary commentator has a book entitled "Is Rationalism Possible in the World of Islam?" And this, I believe, is a great challenge because the rejection of rationalism actually had some very serious consequences for the Muslim Ummah. The first of these consequences was that the exegetes or readers of the Quran began, due to the, let me put it this way, as a result of the reduced reliance on reason and reasoning, the exegetes of the Quran of Revelation began to encounter passages and verses in Revelation in the Quran that struck them as ambiguous and even contradictory. So, in other words, the repression of reason resulted in a reduced understanding of the revelation of the Quran. I mean, how can you understand anything, let alone revelation, without the use of reason? Is not the use of reason a prerequisite for understanding anything, including revelation? So it hardly comes as a surprise that the exegetes began to experience difficulties in understanding the very book that they were trying to explain. Now, additional consequences followed from this, and one of them was that being at a loss to explain some of these allegedly ambiguous or contradictory verses, the ulama reached to the only other source that they knew of to help them to understand the Quran, which was the traditions of the Prophet, peace be on him, known as the hadiths or the ahadith. And so this rejection of reason and reasoning led to the adoption of tradition or the hadith in order to explain the allegedly unclear or ambiguous parts of the Quran. So we will be looking at additional consequences of these, events, but perhaps I can mention one or two more. Another, consequence of the reduced reliance of reason was, as I mentioned, that the exegetes began to encounter not only ambiguous passages in the Quran, but also passages that struck them as contradictory. In other words, they began to see contradictions in the Quran, a book that actually presents itself as consistent, coherent, and free of any flaw, including contradictions. So, how could this have happened? Anyway, as I have been trying to suggest, it happened precisely because of this reduced reliance of reason. So then how did the ulama deal with this additional challenge of encountering verses in the Quran that struck them as contradictory? Well, they dealt with this challenge by basically introducing a new doctrine into the interpretation of Revelation, and this new doctrine was none other than the doctrine or teaching of abrogation. The ulama or the exegetes dealt with the challenge presented by the presence of verses that appeared to them as contradictory. They addressed this issue simply by declaring that the verses revealed later simply abrogated the verses revealed earlier. We will be looking at the significance of this, the adoption of this doctrine of abrogation in the coming videos. For the time being, perhaps we can just recap by summarizing the points made in this particular video, which is that the rejection of reason or the marginalization of reasoning in early Islam was a direct consequence of the struggle between the rationalists and the traditionists, a struggle in which the traditionists prevailed not so much because of better arguments. After all, they did not believe in argumentation, but this was the rejection of reason was a result of the victory of the traditionists over the rationalists through basically political means, through the active repression, political repression of reasoning or thinking, in particular of the 5,000 persons who were slaughtered on the grounds that they committed this crime that basically amounts to little more than thinking. These people were apparently put to death because they were free thinkers, and this was something that was prohibited according to the ulama, who supported the use of tradition in order to explain revelation. So we will leave it at that for the time being, and in a second video we will be looking at the question of how and why tradition was elevated to revelation, on what were the consequences of this decision and practice.